Finally, let me say how honored I am that so many of you thought me worthy of your support. It says more about America than it says about me. In one generation, we have moved from denying a black man service to the lunch counter to elevating one to the highest military office in the nation and to being a serious contender for the presidency. This is a magnificent country. I am proud to be one of its sons. Thank you very much.
General Colin Powell in 1995 announcing that he would not make a run for the U.S. presidency. General Powell had retired from the U.S. military 2 years earlier in 1993. Public opinion polling at the time showed that he was the single most popular public figure in the United States of America at that time. Before he made that speech in 95 announcing he would not run for the presidency, it was very, very possible that he would run. He had written two speeches, one announcing he'd run and one announcing that he wouldn't. Either was possible. He had written a memoir that was a smash success. People mobbed his book events as if they were campaign events. He did travel, including to some of the crucial early states. He did some campaign-style events to basically test the waters and see if running for president was going to be right for him. Colin Powell had been an independent and legitimate nonpartisan throughout his 35 years of military service. Both parties, in fact, considered him as a potential standard bearer in a presidential campaign before he did test the waters in 1995. But in 1995, when he was testing those waters, he made clear that he was a Republican. He said so after leaving the military. The nomination he thought about pursuing for 1996 would have been the Republican Party's presidential nomination, which meant that in 1996, he would have been running to try to make Bill Clinton a one-term president. If he had succeeded in the Republican primary and received his party's nomination, that general election that year would have been incumbent President Bill Clinton versus Republican nominee Colin Powell. My friend Steve Bennett, who is a longtime producer on this show, writes Mattoblog, he was a White House intern that day in 1995 when Colin Powell announced that he would not run for president. Steve told me today, quote, "You'd be amazed at how many people in the Clinton White House that day were watching General Powell's speech live because the stakes were so high." I mean, looking back at it now, looking back at the huge margin by which Bill Clinton won re-election in 1996, it's, in retrospect, seems like a fait accompli that Clinton was always going to get reelected. He was never really in danger. He was always going to be a two-term president. But during Bill Clinton's actual first term in 1995, the prospect of running against that one guy, the prospect of running against Colin Powell, made blood run cold in the Clinton White House. Again, the single most popular public figure in the United States of America. But he decided not to run. General Powell died today at the age of 84 from complications of COVID-19. He was 84 years old. He had survived an earlier bout with prostate cancer. He had Parkinson's disease. He also had multiple myeloma, which is a form of cancer that meant that he was severely immune suppressed. Being vaccinated against COVID-19, as General Powell was, it greatly reduces your risk of getting COVID. It greatly reduces your risk of dying from COVID if you do get infected. But with the rest, as is true with the unvaccinated population, age and medical comorbidities make things worse. With his age and with his other medical issues, he was profoundly vulnerable in the case of infection, and ultimately he did not survive it. By now, you've heard over and over again today the almost unbelievable resume and list of firsts. He was National Security Advisor to President Ronald Reagan. He was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Presidents George H.W. Bush and to President Clinton. He was Secretary of State to President George W. Bush. Left government office in 2004. At each of those tiers of achievement, Colin Powell was the first African American to hold any of those positions. The Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Gene Robinson of the Washington Post wrote today, quote, "Powell long knew how his obituaries would someday describe him. The first African American Secretary of State, the first African American Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first African American National Security Advisor to the President." Robinson wrote, quote, "There is a special pride, but also a special burden in being the first Black fill in the blank. Colin L. Powell shouldered that responsibility while giving the impression that the weight was light as a feather. He was the son of immigrants from Jamaica. He was born in Harlem, raised in the South Bronx. He went to City College in New York, entered the Army through the ROTC program. He was highly decorated for 2 long, difficult combat tours in Vietnam. He was the youngest 1-star general in the United States Army by the time he was 42 years old. He led the invasion of Panama. He led the first Gulf War in 1991. But his impact on the country was beyond even what he did in the U.S. military and the strength of his example as a public servant. It was profoundly political. He announced that he was a Republican in 1995. He announced that he could no longer consider himself a Republican this year, after the attack on the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters on January 6th. That said, he was still a Republican, and he was a decades-long friend of John McCain, someone who'd been floated as a potential running mate for John McCain in 2008, when Colin Powell instead shocked the country by endorsing the Democratic candidate who was running against John McCain. He endorsed Democratic candidate Barack Obama for president. That was 2 weeks before the election in 2008, and some people say that the election might as well have just ended then. If Republicans needed permission to cross the aisle and vote for this Democrat, Barack Obama, nobody could provide a more powerful permission slip than Colin Powell did 2 weeks before that election. His political impact was profound, and it was complex. Of course, in the first sentence of every obituary of General Powell today, along with all of the firsts, and there were many of them, there is also the apex tragedy of his time in public life. His 76-minute-long speech in February 2003 to the United Nations, in which he made a long, detailed, fairly impassioned, and ultimately profoundly false case to the world that the United States needed to invade Iraq, and urgently.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
I remember listening to that live when it happened, listening to those opening lines and being bewildered that this man, that Colin Powell, was making this case. But of course it was him. The tragedy of that moment unfolded soon in Iraq with the U.S. invasion and in the lives of everyone touched by that catastrophic war, which was launched on those false pretenses. But the tragedy of that moment was because of who he was. It was only because General Colin Powell had so much credibility, rightfully earned, that they put him out to make the most unbelievable, unsustainable, ultimately unforgivable false argument for the Iraq war. If they hadn't had him, they wouldn't have made that case that way. If they'd only been able to put out someone of lesser stature, lesser reputation, less widespread respect,